this last point I made before the break is really important. And okay, the last point is really important, and that says it all down here. Valley fill not only changes stratigraphically, and we've seen where we go, and the ideal stratigraphic sequence is going from fluvial to maybe estuarine or marine reworking to open marine shale as you fill up vertically, as you fill one of these valleys. And that's fairly typical, and it makes a good model for incised valley fill reservoir. Now, the important thing, the point I wanted to make with this diagram is that even though you get that vertical stratigraphy, you also get a change laterally as you go from up dip to down dip. And this is just a cartoon that illustrates you have a very nice sandy up dip area, nice incised valley filled sands. If you're way up in the upper reaches of your river, you're not going to have any marine influence at all. In this case, here's the shoreline, the modern day shoreline. So you don't, even in the high tide in this case only comes to about here in this valley. And so there's virtually no marine influence way up there. So everything you get is fluvial sand. As you move down, where you start to get some marine influence, still dominantly fluvial deposition, but with some marine reworking during incoming tides, you might get a mixture of fluvial sands and some marine influence. As you get down here towards the mouth of your valley, you get dominantly marine, and that's marine shales here shown in gray, with some lenticular fluvial sands or estuarine sands kind of encased in the shale. So once again, I point out, if you're drilling wells and getting great wells, and you're up in this part of the system here, that doesn't necessarily mean if you go down dip, you're going to get the same good wells. Maybe the same depositional system may have been deposited at the same time, but it doesn't mean that the reservoir is going to be the same. It's not going to have the same characteristics. So you get those changes both laterally as well as stratigraphically. An important point that is sometimes overlooked. Well, a geologist usually has the trained eye. I'm going to flip back to this. This is kind of a complex diagram, but it shows what a geologist looks for when he's looking for a core. Now, looking at a core, there's different types of bedding styles when you have fluvial deposition than when you have marine or estuarine deposition. Now, the cartoons look pretty similar, but a trained geologist can tell them apart. So if you take a core and you see these features, I'm not going to describe what each feature is, but if you see features like this, it indicates you're kind of down dip in your valley system. And but if you see features like this in your core, it indicates that you're more in the up dip position. So as you go from continental down to the marine environment. So here you see some core descriptions that were taken in part of that sequence of rocks I've been talking about. And the up-dip facies is dominantly fluvial, and so you see a nice blocky log pattern with a nice erosive base to it, and often with a shale beneath it. Okay, so nice blocky log pattern. Permeability is alternating, say, highs and lows, highs and lows. Excuse me, this is porosity. Highs and lows, highs and lows. Porosity is the red. Back up here. Porosity is the red curve, and it remains fairly constant, but the permeability curve, again, is quite variable because you get these minor variations in grain size that are due to the depositional processes. So the variations in grain size give you different permeabilities. So you get alternating high, low permeabilities. When you get down to the marine part, way down dip in the marine facies, or the down dip facies, you get a lot of marine mudstone, and maybe some of these little estuarian type deposits or tidal deposits, something with a deposit with a marine influence with it. Not as good a reservoir. Your down dip size valleys are not as good reservoir as your up dip valleys are. And intermediate, here's kind of the transition phases with core description, and your porosity here is variable, somewhat variable, but quite a range of permeability shown in the green. Quite a range in permeability. So those are the different characteristics you can look for. If you're a geologist that is used to describing cores, you can look for these features, what we call sedimentary structures, that give you an idea of how the sediments were transported and deposited. But if you're more of a porosity and permeability person, you can look at those trends as well. Okay, so very important point. That's about all I want to say about fluvial systems. I'm going to end up with just a general model, a general what we would call a facies model for what I've been talking about. And this is placed within a sequence stratigraphic context, which I haven't been talking about much, but we'll get into that probably tomorrow or the next day. But at any rate, just a general vertical stratigraphy model might look something like this, where you have your floor of the valley, an erosion surface carved during a drop in sea level. You start to backfill, and if you have a high energy river, the lower part might be braided river deposits. Okay, braided river deposits here. Then you go into floodplain deposits with meandering rivers, giving you these lens-like bodies of finer grained sediment that have lower permeability and lower connectivity. And then quite often your maximum transgression, where your shoreline reaches a maximum point, you'll often find a lake deposit in a non-marine environment. That's what that is. And then your high stand, when you start to prograde sediments during high stand time, you go back into this sort of an environment down here where you get lenticular or lens-like meandering river deposits within floodplain shale. So that's a general model that can be useful, that you can use as a starting point for making your interpretation of these types of systems. The best reservoirs are generally going to be down here, but these sands can be good reservoirs, and these sands can be good reservoirs as well. They're just not going to be as good as the braided river deposits. Now that's just a model for the vertical stratigraphy that you might see in a wellbore and a core. Laterally, again, you get the changes. Up dip, you get more of the braided river. Down dip, you tend to get more of your marine influence, lenticular sand bodies in floodplain down near the shoreline. So this is a very nice generalized model to use for valley fill deposits. And I would say that many of the deposits that fluvial deposits that one works with are incised valley fills. And once you recognize the log patterns, it's not difficult to identify these incised valley deposits. On seismic, again, it's not difficult either. You can see the downlapping lateral accretion packages. You can see lenticular channels and things like that. So it's just a matter, it's really what it boils down to is pattern recognition. And if you recognize patterns and get a little idea of how those patterns form, then it's pretty easy to pick up and make your interpretation with well logs or with seismic or with core or with outcrops. And that's why the lectures I give, the approach I take, which you've seen by now, is I like to bring in what were the processes by which the sediments were deposited. And pretty soon it makes sense that if you know how the sediments were deposited, you know what they're going to look like, both vertically and laterally. And so that's why in all the depositional systems that I talk about here in this class, I always talk about also the how the sediments form. So I've tried to show that here. We'll come back to the sequence stratigraphy and do that in more detail, because sequence stratigraphy is a very powerful tool for helping you determine what type of deposit you've got, where it's at within the stratigraphy, and so on. Okay, I'm just going to start in with still the same PowerPoint presentation. And we'll go a few more minutes. And I've broken this part into two parts. I call part one here and part two. And what these represent are different types of shoreline deposits and reservoirs. One type that I'm going to talk about first are what we would call, or what I've been calling, transgressive deposits, where the shoreline is moving landward with time. And you get your sediments deposited during transgression. The part two here is the type of deposits that you get around the shoreline during regression. Okay, when the shoreline is moving seaward and you're prograding. And that would be a case like that. So I'm going to start talking about these. There are some other names for these deposits. Transgressive deposits, we also call them retrogradational. And the regressive deposits, we sometimes call that progradational. So once again, just to reiterate, transgression, shoreline moves landward. What's going to happen? What kind of vertical sequence, vertical stratigraphy are you going to get during a transgression in this sort of an environment? Well, what's going to happen is your shoreline is going to migrate landward. So each successively younger deposit, how can I say this, is, well, let me say it by example. At this instant in geological time, your beach is here, your sand dunes are back here, and your lagoon is back there. Now, if you start transgressing, that beach sand is going to follow the shoreline, so it's now going to overlie, excuse me, the beach sand will now overlie the previous dune sand. It's confusing to try to say this. With further transgression, your beach will move further landward, so it's going to be deposited on top of these lagoonal sections. So you get a vertical stratigraphy that's very diagnostic of transgression, and during regression, the case would be somewhat different. You would have erosion as you expose more and more of the land area as your shoreline is moving seaward, and so you get erosion and deposition seaward of the shoreline. But landward of that shoreline, you tend to get erosion. So I don't know if that's complicated or not, the way I express that, but that's a fundamental principle in stratigraphy. And I'll show you more examples of that as we go along. Well, this is a nice diagram that was published in 2010, showing all the different shoreline environments. The ones that form during progradation or regression are all shown here by this shoreline cartoon. And all of those that form by transgression are shown here. And you can just see with the cartoons that they're different. Okay, so your sand bodies are going to be different. And because of that, your reservoirs are going to be different. Whether you have a shoreline sand deposited during transgression or during progradation or regression. This black line here, I drew this in just kind of arbitrarily, just to separate out the progradational from the transgressive. So let's look first at the transgressive types of shoreline deposits. And I don't know if you guys work in these sorts of environments, shoreline and shallow marine, oftentimes where you've got fluvial systems, just seaward of that, you get into these shoreline systems. So they kind of are coupled together sometimes. They make great reservoirs because they're very sandy for the most part. So why are they so sandy? Why in your shoreline zone do you get all that nice sand? Because you've got waves. And the waves come in and the waves go out, and the waves come in and go out. And all that time you're reworking the sand body. This is a beach here, and it forms these ripple type beds, like a washboard. So rippled sand, in this case caused by outgoing and incoming tides. Outgoing, ingoing, outgoing, ingoing, so on. Now, one of the reasons these make great reservoirs is because they're, first of all, they're reworked sand, so they're often quite good reservoirs. But also they're oftentimes in the environment of deposition, they're very long. So you get these big big long reservoirs. They may not be very wide before you get back into your muddy lagoonal deposit, but they're very often very long. Now this particular picture was taken after a hurricane on the U.S. Gulf Coast. And what you see here is you've got your sand body, then you've got your lagoon behind the sand body, but you also have a little fan-shaped body of sand like that. There's another one here, another one there. These are all deposits that formed during a hurricane. The hurricane, the winds move landward, and they pick at very high velocity, and they pick up the sand and push it into the lagoonal environment. Well, that makes a very good reservoir. If this sort of process goes on over a period of geological time, what you're going to have is these little sand bodies encased in lagoonal mud, surrounded by lagoonal mud. So you get a very nice stratigraphic trap that way. So these can be, there's some very nice reservoirs that form in that manner. I'm going to end the day on a little exercise. This is a seismic section off Peru, offshore Peru. And what you see, and what I want you to focus on is just what's above this red line. So can you take a couple of minutes and tell me where your shoreline sands are on that seismic line? Okay, just take a couple of minutes and figure out. Remember, we're in a transgressive system, so the shoreline is migrating landward. In this case, landward is to the left and seaward is to the right. So where in there would you drill a well? And what kind of well would you want to drill? Do you want to drill a vertical well, a horizontal well, or a slant well? Those are the questions here for this exercise.
Esto es donde depositas. Sí. Casi todo está bien.
Entonces puedo ponerse vertical. Por acá.
Claro, pero si quieres, si pones vertical ya no interceptas esto. Si es uno dirigido, aquí interceptas todo. Bueno, te dibujo, ¿no? Todo. Bueno, pues el abajo me dibujo. ¿Dónde?
Dos horizontales.
¿En dónde? ¿En dónde? ¿Estás hablando de eso o de gratis? Yo de gratis. Exacto. Millonarios.
Okay, I think that was a fairly easy one. Looks like you've got it figured out. Remember that the shoreline now during transgression, the shoreline is moving this way. And where you have these long linear sand bodies. In this case, they're filled with gas, and so you get a nice high amplitude. Remember, these sand bodies aren't very wide, but they can be very long. So you're looking at a cross section. Here's one there, one there, one there, one there, one there. See how they're climbing? We call that climbing stratigraphically. As you go landward, they're each one of those sand bodies that forms a beach stratigraphically a little bit higher than the preceding one. Anybody tell me where a delta would be associated with this? Or let me just say progradation. This really gets into sequence stratigraphy, and when we get into sequence stratigraphy, we'll do a better interpretation of this. But let me just point out now that here's your shoreline sands. What are you going to have between each shore, behind each shoreline sand? You're going to have marine mudstones, so offshore mudstones there, something like that. And once you go through a transgressive period, according to my sea level curve, you then go through a regressive or high stand systems tract, we sometimes call it. And that is a period of time where you get progradation of sediments. And what do I see here? But very nice progradational features right there. There. Downlapping onto a surface, the uppermost of these transgressive deposits. Then you've got downlapping and progradation. So up here, the sediments are moving this way, left to right, or in a seaward direction. That's just an aside. We'll do this again when I talk to you about sequence stratigraphy. But one more little example, and then we'll call it a day. And what you see up here in this little corner here is if you had a series of well logs, this is what this stratigraphy would look like with well logs, where you'd have one shoreline sand, and then another one slightly landward, another one landward, and another one landward. So that's what would look like on well logs. So why don't you take 2 minutes, this should be less than 2 minute exercise, and on your computer you've got this, do a correlation. Just spend a couple of minutes correlating. These are a series of wells, gamma ray logs. I've got a stratigraphic datum here. This is all a transgressive type deposits. And so how are you going to correlate those sands?
De abajo se empieza así. Sí. No, hasta aquí no.
There's only two choices here, a correct one and an incorrect one.
Sí, pues sí. Ayudarme.
You're interpreting this as one continuous sand body, okay? If you use this interpretation, you're saying that there's several different sand bodies that are not connected. So a fundamental difference between the two. So you want to be sure to think about that. And a key to answering this is to find a good stratigraphic datum to put your cross-section on so that you can see that these are at a greater depth than the ones here, and the whole system is what we call stepping in a landward direction. Land is over here, sea is over here. So going back to the seismic line, where would you want to put a well? I'd put a well, I'm sure you'd all do the same. You'd all put a well something like this. We'd come down and we'd slant that well like that, okay?
Yes.
And we'd get all those sand bodies.
Celoso.
So here,
Ya estás listo para el mundo de...
so here we take our well, we go down like this, and we do really well. Make a very good well out of that. Because you're breaking over, these are all little shale barriers in between the sand, and you're breaking through them when you're drilling the well. Well, we can end on a positive note like that we just drilled a great well offshore.